he said it was smart to avoid paying taxes. Yesterday, his campaign was bragging it makes him a genius. Here's my question. What kind of genius loses $1 billion in a single year? This is Trump to a T. He's taken corporate excess and made a business model out of it. He abuses his power, games the system, puts his own interests ahead of the country's. It's Trump first and everyone else last.
Trump, clearly recognizing that he's on the defensive, gave extended prepared remarks today on this matter at a rally in Pueblo, Colorado.
The unfairness of the tax laws is unbelievable. It's something I've been talking about for a long time, despite, frankly, being a big beneficiary of the laws. But I'm working for you now. I'm not working for Trump. As a businessman and real estate developer, I have legally used the tax laws to my benefit and to the benefit of my company, my investors, and my employees. I mean, honestly, I have brilliantly used those laws.
So that is not the only area, however, where Donald Trump is on defense. The AP has a new piece out in which more than 20 cast and crew members of The Apprentice were interviewed, and some of them described crass and sexist behavior by Trump. The Center for Public Integrity published a report that more than a decade ago, Trump's real estate company rented office space to an Iranian bank with purported ties to Hezbollah and Hamas. And today we also learned that on Friday, New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman sent Trump a letter notifying him that his charitable foundation is violating state law for soliciting donations without the proper certification, and ordered it to cease its fundraising immediately. So, Mark, Donald Trump does not have all that many more news cycles left to burn. So the question, the burning question, so to speak, can he get off of defense and onto offense before the debate on Sunday? And if so, how?
Not entirely. The public polling that's out today, which we'll discuss later in the program, is mostly bad for him. There's a few bright spots, but clearly he's lost ground since the debate. All the totality of the national and battleground state polling suggests. He's on the defensive, and the debate performance is what set it all off. And so I just think the press is not, even if things go slightly his way, barring some huge disclosure about Hillary Clinton, I think Trump's going to be on the defensive. He can claw his way back, but it really does wait for the debate.
Here's how this tax story, I think, is problematic for him, because, first of all, the reporters involved are still, they're promising they're working on more stories to come. They want to get those stories out as soon as possible, ideally before this debate, so they're pursuing that angle. You know, Trump's argument here about the tax thing would be very powerful, I think, if he actually put his tax returns out and said, here's the ways in which I've manipulated the system. I'm going to put all of that to an end when I'm president. Another Donald Trump in the world, people like me wouldn't be able to do what I did here. But as it is, we are still left to ask the question, what else is in the tax returns? In what other ways did he manipulate the tax system? What is the actual story here? And that's why I think those questions will persist over this week and keep him on defense all the way till Sunday.
I'll tell you another thing that probably most voters aren't thinking about, but I'm thinking about. Most of the stories involving the foundation reflect very poorly on Trump's attorneys. Whoever was doing the legal work for the foundation, they made a lot of mistakes. I doubt Trump was directly involved in too many of those decisions, but the lawyers should have stopped him from doing some of these things. These same types of people, lawyers and accountants, would have been involved in handling his tax returns. So I think Trump now even more needs to release his returns, because while the New York Times story doesn't allege that he did anything illegal, or that they even necessarily pushed the envelope, he has shown clearly that he hires lawyers and accountants who are not very careful in what they do.
Well, yes, and of course, when you hire bad people, ultimately you're responsible, just as a candidate is responsible for his campaign.
As a filer of tax returns,
and as someone who runs a charitable foundation, you can't just lay it off on the attorneys and the accountants. Again, if he keeps not releasing the tax returns after this revelation, it just raises, it just makes people wonder, what else is a problem in the tax returns?
Yep. Well, as I mentioned, there is this possibility, of course, always, of a revelation involving the Clintons. At 3 a.m. tomorrow morning, Eastern Time, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is expected to make what his group is billing as a major announcement by video. The exact content of this is unclear at this hour, but Assange has long promised to release additional documents related to Hillary Clinton. And today, Donald Trump's political advisor, Roger Stone, who has long talked up Assange and his prospects of changing the race, tweeted this cryptic message. Quote, I have total confidence that at WikiLeaks and my hero, Julian Assange, will educate the American people soon. Hashtag lock her up. There are a lot of Republicans holding out hope that this or some other October surprise that the Democrats cannot control will be the thing that takes Clinton down and allows Trump to go ahead. So, John, what are the kinds of surprises that Hillary Land is most worried about in these final weeks of the campaign?
Well, they obviously are worried about the WikiLeaks thing, and I think, you know, I should stipulate, unless you know something I don't, we have no idea what might be in these documents. You know, if there was something that was genuinely scandalous, I mean like criminal behavior that was in the email, that would be hugely problematic. And I think they are still focused on her health. You know, part of the reason why she was so effective in that first debate was she came out, she looked strong, healthy, robust, confident.
She did a somersault? Oh, no, that was Kate McKinnon.
Yes.
But she looked good.
She looked good.
Yeah.
If she were to have another health thing occur of some kind, whether it's pneumonia or something more serious, between now and Election Day, that would be a big problem.
You know, I've been covering Clinton's scandal since 1992, and they have down a pattern and a practice of how to push back on them.
Right.
One of the big questions involving any potential Clinton controversy or scandal is, does the staff know everything? And it'd be fascinating to know if her war room knows what's in her 30,000 deleted emails, which, for all we know, WikiLeaks has access to.
Yep.
Are they ready for any possible disclosure, be it about yoga, be it about a wedding, or be it about the foundation?
You know, the thing is, what they like to do, as you know, as you alluded to just now, they like to attack the credibility of the source. And Julian Assange is a rich topic in that area, not a guy with a lot of sympathy among American voters to the extent they know who he is. But I will say, the one thing we also know about the Clintons is they always divide their legal and their political into different houses. The lawyers know everything, and the political people often know very little, and that's a problem in terms of defense.
If there's any Clinton controversy, their first response will be, this is an old story brought up by political enemies trying to distract from the real issues in this campaign.
You scripted that very well. You may have even actually...
I can do it in my sleep, just the way Brian Fallon can.
All right. Okay, up next, our brand new Bloomberg Politics North Carolina poll, plus the overlooked policy issues of the 2016 presidential campaign, after these words from our sponsors. Welcome back. We have a brand new Bloomberg Politics Battleground State poll out today looking at North Carolina, which remains an essential part of Donald Trump's narrow path to victory in November. In a four-way race, our poll shows Hillary Clinton leading among likely voters by just 1 percentage point. She's up 44 to 43% over Trump. Clinton is up by the same margin in a two-way race there in North Carolina, according to our poll. That is slightly tighter than another new poll where it shows the Tar Heel State. This one is from a batch of Quinnipiac University surveys released this afternoon. So let's look at those. Take a look at this map. There we have Hillary Clinton up by 3 points, 46 to 43% among likely voters in North Carolina. New Q polls put Clinton up 5 points in Florida, 46 to 41%, and up 4 points in Pennsylvania, 45 to 41%. All of those measured in four-way races. But in Ohio, the outlier, Trump seems to be gaining ground. There, Quinnipiac has him leading Clinton by 5 points among likely Buckeye voters, 47 to 42%. Now, there is one more poll that I want to show you. Let's take a look at this. In New Mexico, a state that would ordinarily be considered safely stashed in Clinton's column, an Albuquerque Journal survey released yesterday shows Clinton beating Trump by just 4 points, 35 to 31%. Now, how is that possible, you might ask, because New Mexico's been blue for a pretty long time. Well, you got to think about Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson, who is a two-time governor, of course, of the Land of Enchantment. He polls a hefty 24% of likely voters in that poll. So, Mark, looking at all that stuff, those Q polls, our poll, the Albuquerque Journal poll, where does that leave the electoral math and the electoral map?
Well, Trump has fallen behind further than he was going into the first debate. He had the momentum, and he had polled almost even with Clinton, where there was a plausible electoral college path. He must win Florida and North Carolina to have a chance. He's behind in those states. But if you look at where she is in these polls, you look at where he is, he can come back, particularly if Gary Johnson gets a decent percentage chance to vote. I think for Trump to win, he needs some combination of, besides the big three in Iowa, Ohio, North Carolina, Florida, and Iowa, he needs probably 3 small states, unless he can win Pennsylvania, which looks less likely. The reality is, I think Trump needs to win both debates. He needs probably Clinton to have some big stumble or disclosure, and he needs to perform day in and day out better. Without those things, I think he will get tens of millions of votes. I think he'll get over 200 electoral votes, but he'll lose.
And lose. Yeah. I mean, the worrying thing for Trump are a couple things you said, a couple worrying things. One is the Gary Johnson vote is starting to collapse now, and you're starting to see it in some of these polls. And as that happens, it seems to be accruing to Hillary Clinton's benefit. A lot of that vote is going to end up in her column or staying home. You look at a lot of those small states that he has to put together if he's going to make that map work once he wins the essential ones. Put aside this New Mexico thing, is a little bit of an anomaly, but in Nevada, where he's been ahead, she suddenly looks like she's ahead. Colorado looks like she's ahead by a lot. Pennsylvania is probably out of reach. New Hampshire, she's always been stronger than him there. It's just, the dauntingness of it. This lost week for Trump, when he was right on the brink of maybe being even with her, to suddenly see himself slipping on all these fronts right now. If I'm in the Trump campaign, I am scared.
I'll say again, I've said it from the beginning, she's the favorite. He's been hurt badly in the last week, but we shouldn't overreact. A good week for him, a bad week for her, he can get back close to parity, but he's always going to have a narrow path.
Polls are a snapshot in time, but the time is running out.
Are getting lost in all the political sniping that's occurred for months are the major policy issues that would normally get at least some attention in the coverage of any race to the White House. Today, for instance, the New York Times had a great front page story by Robert Pear about the future of the Affordable Care Act after the election. And on our website right now, BloombergPolitics.com, great story by our colleague Jennifer Epstein on a Hillary Clinton proposal to limit contracts that make it more difficult for workers and consumers to bring legal action against corporations. Out on the campaign trail, candidates have dipped a pinky toe into the policy waters. Trump talks at times about his tax plan, a proposal for child care deductions, energy. Today, he announced a cyber review team that he says will look at the issue of online security. Clinton, in turn, has unveiled plans for expanding opportunities for workers with disabilities, reining in student debt, curbing prescription drug costs, and others. But they don't get very much coverage. So, John, with 36 days to go, why has there been even less policy coverage than in the past? And is there anything that can be done before Election Day?
Because we are suckers for the shiny object. And when I say we, I mean our colleagues and us to some extent. You know, these two candidates provide compelling, hilarious, appalling theater almost every day, and it's hard to resist covering that stuff and focusing in the way that we obviously should more on the issues of substance.
It's hard to cover policy when the campaigns won't give you policy experts. We ask all the time.
That's true.
It's also hard, as you said, when you've got this thing. You know, I always say, it's hard to cover policy the week before the New Hampshire primary, the week before, Super Tuesday.
And this whole campaign's been like that.
And this whole campaign is like that. There's always a big thing. There's no lulls. The candidate didn't take the summers off, but still, and again, not exempting ourselves, I will look back and say that one of the great failures of this cycle was we let the candidates and the circus carnival freak show atmosphere that the Trump and Clinton campaigns have created, more Trump than Clinton, and just never really just said, you know what, today we need to do 20 minutes on education.
But I'll also add this other important thing. You're right about the fact that the campaigns don't focus on policy enough. Trump has almost no policies. Clinton's are buried on a website. But it's also the case the Clinton campaign is making this race intentionally about Trump's temperament, and temperament questions they're not focused on Trump's lack of policies. They're focused on his business record and his temperament. I'll say in these last few days, we don't have much time left, but it's still not too late, right? We could talk about health care. Good story in the New York Times today about this. We could talk about the Affordable Care Act. We could talk about criminal justice reform. There are issues about that going on all across the country. There are a lot of jobs, obviously. There are things that we could try to do, and we should do. We all should do, to try to get a little bit of policy in before we get to Election Day.
Yeah, because the voters are going to be electing someone who have a huge influence on their lives. Ding.
All right, up next, hand me that thing. This is mine. Do you know who these two people are? These dudes? Find out after this.
Everywhere you go in Gotham City, people are talking about one thing and one thing only, the two men who are going to take the debate stage tomorrow night in Virginia. All right, I'm kidding. Talking about other stuff as well, including the Mets. But we sent our Bloomberg Politics team to Times Square today to see what New Yorkers and tourists know about the two guys, these two guys, the two vice presidential running mates.
Do you know who these guys are?
No, I do not.
Any ideas?
Nah.
No? Nothing? Nothing?
No.
You?
I do not.
You?
No idea.
That's Mitt Romney, I think.
Mitt Romney? No, it's not Mitt Romney. What job do you think they have?
He's probably a CEO.
CEO?
A CEO or
Newscaster, I don't know.
American football coach.
They look like sports coaches or something.
like a sports analyst.
Sports analyst. Yeah, it kind of
Sporty,
looks like that.
yeah. I think they look like they golf. I thought they were in the golf world.
Actually, I would. They look like golfers.
You know who that is? Yeah?
The vice presidential candidates.
Got it. Wow. Do you know their names?
Mike Pence and Tim Kaine.
Pence, and I'm not sure about the Democrat.
That's Pence, and I forget his name.
Tim.
Oh, man. Yeah.
Tim, I can't think of his last name.
Oh, you're so close.
Well, I use a cane right
You
now.
use a what?
I use a cane.
You know their names?
Yeah, Kane and Prince or something.
You know what his name is?
Pence?
Whoa, big time.
No idea what that one is.
Tim Kaine.
Tim Kaine. Oh, yeah, I saw him. He done a really boring speech at a convention.
Which one is Pence?
Yes.
Wrong. No.
This is Trump's VP. This is Hillary's VP.
Ooh. Oh, I should know that.
Who do you think would win in a debate between the two of them?
Probably this guy. He looks a little more intellectual.
What words come to mind when you look at them?
I think he's like a charmer.
Charmer.
Yeah.
Like a ladies' man.
Yes.
Definitely a ladies'
Yeah,
man.
yeah.
Would you want him representing you on the world stage? Going to London, going to Beijing? He looks like Putin would run rings around him.
You think Pence is going to win?
I think Pence is going to
Why?
win.
Why?
He just seems more presidential. Vice presidential.
He has that stare, I don't know.
What do you mean that stare?
He's looking right through us.
He looks winnable.
He looks winnable?
Yeah.
I'm sure he'd love to hear that.
Both of them have a nice smile.
Looks can be deceiving, but they look like nice people.
Distinguished looking.
Distinguished looking.
Yeah. One thing wrong with both of them, they're politicians.
Boom.
They are politicians. Mike Pence and Tim Kaine are experienced at their jobs. Both were considered safe picks for their respective candidates. So, John, this debate's not going to get a lot of attention. No one expects it to be highly rated. But it does matter. So what's the best case scenario for the Trump-Pence campaign and for Clinton and Kaine out of this debate?
Seems to me Mike Pence has a couple jobs, one of which is the job that Joe Biden had 4 years ago, which is to kind of, a shaky Republican electorate that's worried about how Donald Trump is, kind of get them calmed down and revved up simultaneously. So he's got a kind of a partisan job. He's not going to spend a lot of time reaching out to the center. I think he's got to kind of consolidate that Republican vote that's worried about where Trump is right now. And, and if he does that, that'll be a good debate for him. Tim Kaine, I think, has the opportunity, because of how well Hillary Clinton has done, not just in the debate, but for the past week, to start to reach out and to try to exploit some of that same shakiness and reach out to Republicans as they've been doing, try to kind of convince those suburban Republican women who are shaky about Trump, and maybe more so after the last week, to come over to the Democratic side.
I think Pence can do three things to help the ticket. One is to show Donald Trump how it's done. Talk about changing Washington, talk about the Clintons being part of the old guard. Right. Two, he can reach out to the Republican base. There are a lot of Republican activists, religious conservatives, social conservatives, economic conservatives who maybe don't trust Trump but like Pence. And to get to see that Pence will be part of the ticket if they win, I think, or part of the White House if they win, I think is a strong thing. And the last thing Pence can do, as you said, is kind of be a circuit breaker. If the story of the night is he wins, it gives them back a little momentum. Kaine, I think, can talk about the Clinton message in a way that's singing out of the exact same hymn book as Hillary Clinton. There's really not much difference between the two of them on anything she's running on. The other thing he can do, I think, is try to put Pence on the defensive. Yeah. Pence has been pretty skillful in TV interviews and elsewhere, kind of avoiding confronting some of Trump's more out there statements. I think if Kaine is skillful, he can really try to make Pence own it in a way that could be the story of the night. Right, and the thing to always remember here is that although Mike Pence is a very conservative guy, many people will say Tim Kaine should go after Mike Pence on about how he approaches gays and lesbians in Indiana. That's not going to be the job. Tim Kaine's job is going to be to pin Mike Pence on Trump. They're both representatives of the guys at the top of the ticket. This isn't a debate about Kaine versus Pence. It's about them as stand-ins for their respective overlords, as it were, the nominees on the ticket. Yeah. The other thing is, you had to say that the Clinton-Pence team came out of the first debate, not just with Hillary Clinton having performed better, but most of the topics they wanted to cover got covered either because they were brought up by Lester Holt or because Clinton skillfully brought them up. Pence has the opportunity to bring up some of the things related to the Clinton Foundation, her emails, some things about the Obama Clinton record on foreign policy and kind of put them out there in a prominent way outside the presidential debate, as prominent a platform as you can get at this point, and to try to make them part of the conversation between Wednesday morning after the debate through the Sunday presidential.
I know a lot of people think this debate's going to be boring, and I myself at various times have said vanilla ice cream versus vanilla pudding. But the truth is, both of these guys are men of substance. They know a lot of stuff. They've both been in government for a long time. And one of the things that was, on the basis of our earlier conversation, disappointing about the first debate was it was so utterly, totally devoid of substance. This could be an interesting debate. It will not be fireworks and ice cream and sodas coming out of the debate center, but it could be something where they actually talk about stuff of real merit.
There better be Diet Coke in the debate.
Well, I know. Well, you'll need that.
I will need that to stay awake. I think both these guys are generally liked and respected by the political establishment.
Yeah.
Both of them are preparing a ton. Yeah. Tim Kaine is working with a lot of the same team that's prepared Hillary Clinton. He is a serious guy. And Pence, again, I'll say, set an example. The Trump campaign needs every bit of help it can get to try to convince Donald Trump that even though he's still drawing crowds of thousands of people, he needs to prepare for the next debate. And if Mike Pence, after all this preparation, does better than Tim Kaine by some measure, right, I think his folks can say to Trump, look, Kaine prepared, this is the result, please, please prepare for the debate.
They could say that, but whether Trump will listen is a totally different story.
Yep. All right, up next, a little strategizing with a couple of strategists after this word from our sponsors.
So this is the time when we talk a little strategery with the strategerists, Republican style. We're joined by Sarah Isgur Flores, GOP strategist, who was once the campaign manager for Carly Fiorina's presidential campaign. She's joining us from Farmville, Virginia, where the vice presidential debate will take place tomorrow. And in our D.C. bureau, we have Barry Bennett, a former Trump advisor and current Trump supporter. Ladies and gentlemen, good to see you both. Sarah, let me start with you. I'm going to ask Barry the same question in a moment. How bad has the last week been for Donald Trump? Just give a sense of just how bad you think it's been in terms of his electoral prospects.
I mean, yeah, it's been bad. You know, when the election has been about Donald Trump, he doesn't do well. I think the most telling number, though, are the economy numbers in the latest CNN poll. He was up 15 at the beginning of September. He's now in a virtual tie with Hillary Clinton, which is a huge swing in who voters trust to handle the economy. I don't necessarily think it was the debate that did it, but it's a sustained look at Donald Trump this week that we've seen through the summer, and now voters don't actually like it when it's about Donald Trump. They don't like him. When it's about Hillary, they don't like her.
So, Barry, I'm looking at those same numbers that Sarah just cited. He's down 8 on strong and decisive leader. He's down 5 on temperament to serve effectively as president. He's down 6 on can better handle responsibilities of commander-in-chief. Those are not pretty numbers. I can't believe you're going to say the last week was great for Donald Trump, but just give me a sense of evaluate how serious you think the threat is of what happened over the course of the last 7 or 8 days.
Well, I think if you look at this, you have to be kind of amazed that the polling numbers haven't dropped more. I mean, you lose the debate 2-1 in all these public polls, and you only lose a point or a point and a half. It's pretty stunning. So, you know, I think a lot of this is literally baked in. I mean, I know we've used that phrase over and over again, but it seems to me like it's going to be hard to shock the voters at this point.
Barry, what do you think Donald Trump's national popular vote ceiling is as a percentage in a 4-way vote?
I mean, isn't that the question? We keep, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I asked Barry first. What do you think that is?
I think the winner is probably at a 44 or 45.
That low. Sarah, do you agree that it's only going to take 45 to win?
I think betting against Donald Trump on his ceiling has been proven to be a poor bet time and time again. But give or take, I think Barry might be a point low, 2 points low, but I think he's about right.
Right. Well, it seems to me that's kind of the critical question, because I think Trump can get to 45 and nationally in the battleground state polls. I'm not sure he can get to 46 or 47. So,
I mean, you look at Ohio, he's already at, what, 47 in the latest polling I've seen.
Right.
So, yeah, you can get there. Turnout, you know, if turnout could add 2 or 3 points to these polls. So, you know, he could get there.
Sarah, if you were in the holding room with Mike Pence tomorrow night, and he said, Sarah, what's the one thing I need to accomplish on the stage, what would you tell him?
If I was actually advising Mike Pence, I actually thought Dave Kochel had the best piece came out tonight, I think, in the Wall Street Journal. Mike Pence should go rogue. If they ask him, you know, do you think Donald Trump should have turned over his tax returns? Mike Pence should say, yeah, I turned over my tax returns. At this point, if this is really baked in, if the election's going to be about Donald Trump, which isn't good for Donald Trump, Mike Pence would do himself a lot of favors down the road, 2020, if he breaks with his top of the ticket a little bit and says, like, yeah, I think he should turn over his tax returns. I turned over mine,
Sarah,
but I don't think he'll do that.
Sarah, with all due respect, that's the silliest thing I've ever heard on this program. What should he actually?
That's it. That's the silliest thing.
What should he actually do?
I actually think that he is the voice of reason on this ticket.
But let's say he wants to help Trump win. What should he do?
Then he needs to make it all about Hillary Clinton. He needs to make the next week about Hillary Clinton. But that was something that the Trump campaign's been unwilling to do, so I don't see how Mike Pence would be the one to do it.
Barry, I don't want to ignore the question of the vice presidential debate, because I think it could be interesting and it may have some small bit of political effect. But I actually want to look to the next presidential debate. If you were in the room, invited in to work on Donald Trump's debate prep, what would your advice be to him about how to remediate the problems he's caused himself?
Well, this next is the town hall format. Vastly different experience, right? Here you get a chance to actually connect with the questioner. You can actually score points on friendliness in a town hall format where you can't standing behind a podium. So I think it's very important how he interacts with the questioner and answers their question directly, quickly, and then pivot to something else. But it's an entirely different format, which I think probably plays to his advantage a little bit.
Sarah, how big just describe the complexity involved. One of the things about the format is the two of them can step out from behind the podium and kind of get in each other's space. He's obviously a big man. She's a woman. Just how volatile and dangerous is that territory when you get the two of them out there with the gender dynamics that are in play?
You know, I'm actually not that worried about this. I agree with Barry that this format widely favors Donald Trump over the last format, which did not. Donald Trump has better television skills, better charisma on camera. So I think that this, barring some catastrophe, will lean his way, which, you know, if you want to do better, the second debate closer to the election might be the time to shine. Yes, should he get into Hillary Clinton's face? Probably not. But anything barring, again, sort of a, you know, a poking her moment, I think he's fine.
Sarah, if you look at the states Trump needs to win to get to 270 or more, if you were the Trump campaign, which one would be concerning you the most these days?
North Carolina. North Carolina, where other Republican Senate candidates have been polling ahead of Donald Trump. The Senate race is now a heat. Donald Trump is behind in the latest polling. I'd be very concerned that you're not doing better in a state like North Carolina. Look at Ohio, where he's above where I think many people thought he would be at this point, and Portman's even above that, which is kind of a nice safety net for him. He needs to look for that in these other states.
Barry, why would Donald Trump be behind in a state that Mitt Romney won against Barack Obama?
Well, I think that, the one thing that we know that North Carolina, Florida, and Ohio, and Pennsylvania all have in common is that today there are 200,000 fewer Democrats in each of those states than there were 4 years ago. So, the underpinnings are pretty good. So I think he'll close. I think he'll do fine. I mean, I'd love to, he's going to run some ads for the first time. Let's see what those ads do. But, I feel pretty good about it.
All right. Sarah Isgur Flores and Barry Bennett, thank you. You're great to come on. We will talk next about Donald Trump's rough week with a few of the reporters who cover him right after this. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can also listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
Many of you, today's the first day back at work, but for some Americans, like reporters covering Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, they've been on the clock all weekend. Joining us now to rehash the weekend, look ahead to today and beyond, Bloomberg Politics reporter Kevin Cirilli, who's in Washington, and NBC News' Katie Tur, who's in Pueblo, Colorado. Both cover Donald Trump with alarming regularity. Guys, we're going to start with some sound from the event that Donald Trump had this afternoon, where he talked about the unrest we've seen in some major American cities.
We're a divided nation, and each week it seems we're getting more and more divided, with race riots on our streets on a monthly basis. Now, somebody said, don't call them race riots, but that's what they are. They're race riots. And it's happening more and more.
Kevin, some days it's not clear to me what message Donald Trump is trying to drive. He talked about a lot of different things at a couple events already. What messages do you think he's on today?
Well, I think earlier today he was discussing, obviously, the turmoil and the unrest happening in our cities throughout the country. But Mark, I think you really hit the nail on the head right there, because the past week for Donald Trump's campaign, there has not been a cohesive message. Now, we've seen a little bit of it, but when Donald Trump goes on Twitter, the issue of follow the money and the issue of attacking Hillary Clinton for the Clinton Foundation or her Wall Street paid speeches, all of that goes away and is overshadowed by, of course, something that he says off teleprompter. That has been a huge challenge for the senior aides that I speak with, that I'm sure Katie speaks with as well, and it has really, really, really set them back.
Katie, there's no way in which you could describe this moment as Donald Trump, other than like the campaign and Donald Trump himself should be feeling embattled right now. Is that the atmosphere around him right now, embattled, or is it something else?
100%. I think the campaign realizes that it is now or never, and that's why you heard Donald Trump very much on teleprompter here in Pueblo, Colorado. We were told he was going to get a little bit deeper into his own personal history, his business history, in direct response to what came out over the weekend, that nearly $1 billion declaration he made on his 1995 taxes. The campaign realizing that they need to find a way to spin that. They have been in full battle mode now for over 7 days. It's been controversy after controversy, scandal after scandal, not just allegations of sexism, which bubbled up again today, but the taxes, and also the Attorney General coming out and filing a cease and desist order on the Trump Foundation for not filing the correct paperwork. So the Trump campaign is trying to push back on all fronts. So what you heard here today is Donald Trump try to reframe the narrative, paint himself as somebody who was an underdog back in the 90s, who everybody was rooting against, someone they wanted to see fail when he was going through his difficulties in the 90s, losing $1 billion nearly in 1 year. He says that he was able to rebuild himself, and he was able to bring himself back up despite what everybody was saying about him. He won. I won, he said over and over again. He's trying to tell voters that he's going to do the same thing for them. But guys, we are 36 days until the election, and Donald Trump is having a very hard time, as Kevin just mentioned, staying on message, let alone one cohesive message, one coherent message. We're going to see how long this sticks and whether it's going to do anything for those undecided voters, or if those voters have already decided that they are going to go towards Hillary Clinton.
Kevin, he sounds like he's trying to turn himself into the comeback kid.
Well, yeah, but and who doesn't love a good comeback story? But, I mean, I think in addition to all of that, we have to look behind the scenes where the RNC is saying that they have the appropriate ground game in place to turn out voters on Election Day. But I have to be honest, the sources that I'm speaking with in swing states such as Florida, for example, would paint a different picture. And so in addition to trying to put out all of these fires, I think there are some real operational questions about the political ground game with the Trump campaign. Now, that being said, just anecdotally speaking, you talk to a lot of independent voters, and we'll have to, of course, wait a couple days to see what the polls and whether or not they reflect this. But you talk to voters, and the Trump message on defense for his issue with the tax returns is that he was able to be smart enough to beat the system, and that this is just another example for why the system is so messed up. So to some small business owners, to some independent voters, again, this is just simply a lesser of two evils decision, if you will, between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And I'm not necessarily sure that the tax issue right now, we'll have to see if more comes out, but I'm not sure right now that issue will convince independent voters who are concerned about both candidates to turn their back on Trump just yet.
All right, we're going to take our Trump reporter dyad and turn it into a Trump reporter triad by adding Jenna Johnson, political reporter for the Washington Post, who covers Donald Trump. And Jenna, I'm going to actually play a little sound for you to react to. Here's how Donald Trump attacked Hillary Clinton during his rally on Saturday night in Manheim, Pennsylvania. I know you have a lot to say about that. Let's go.
I hear too many stories about Pennsylvania, certain areas. I hear too many bad stories, and we can't lose an election because of you know what I'm talking about. So go and vote, and then go check out areas, because a lot of bad things happen, and we don't want to lose for that reason. We don't want to lose, but we don't want to lose for that reason. So go over and watch carefully. Here's a woman. She's supposed to fight all all of these different things. And she can't make it 15 feet to her car. Give me a break. Give me a break. I don't even think she's loyal to Bill. You want to know the truth.
Those are just some of the highlights from that event in Pennsylvania on Saturday. Jenna, you were there and you wrote a detailed, brilliant, evocative, wonderful piece about it. Just tell us what it was like to be there and watch that spectacle unfold.
Sure. So I've been to more than 100 Donald Trump rallies over the past year, and especially in the last couple weeks and months, he's gotten really good at staying on message, reading from a teleprompter, sticking to the talking points that his staff has given him. And Saturday night was an example of him just forgetting all of that and letting loose and saying exactly what he's thinking and saying a lot of things that I don't think we've ever heard a presidential candidate say at a rally before. This rally in particular, I had planned on writing an article about him seizing on comments that Hillary Clinton made months ago, but that just became public, about Bernie Sanders' millennial supporters and, you know, why they're unemployed and why they like him. And in one comment she made about them living in their parents' basements. And so his campaign had sent out this statement saying he's going to give this statement tonight, he's going to seize on these comments. And so I kind of pre-wrote a story thinking that was going to be the news of this event. And I had to delete that story and write a new story because he couldn't stay on message. You could just tell he was so angry and so frustrated about all these other things.
Katie, to what extent can we say that the Trump senior staff is currently frustrated as opposed to just accepting that Trump will be Trump?
You know, I think if they're not frustrated, then that would be surprising at the moment. They wanted to get him more on message earlier. That's why we saw him get on teleprompter. That's why you see these indications from the campaign that he's going to say this, that, or the other, or stick pretty closely to a message at a campaign rally. We hadn't seen that before this current team came on board. There's a desire to make sure that he is prepared for the debates. But this 3 a.m. tweeting, this mocking of Hillary Clinton, being sick and doing an impression of her is not something that helps his image as somebody who has the correct temperament to be president. So if the senior staff on Donald Trump's campaign is not frustrated, I'm not so sure. They must be seeing different polling than the rest of us are seeing, because that Donald Trump is not one that rates particularly well. Even with his own supporters, they laugh at it. They think it's funny. But when you talk to them and you ask them if this is what their presidential candidate should be doing, they say no, it's a distraction. We might enjoy it, but we don't think it helps his message. We don't think it helps him convince voters who might be unsure about him.
All right, the Trump coverage dynamic trio is going to take some yoga breaths and rest a moment. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back and talk about how Donald Trump seems to be preparing for the upcoming town hall debate right after this.
Well, General, thank you, and thank you for your bravery. Amazing. I've heard your name mentioned many times, so thank you for being here, and thank you for the question. So first of all, I want to ask you one question. You had all those aircraft landings on the carriers, right? As I understand, it's a very, very special talent.
It's a talent that you acquire if you start off with the basics.
Okay, very good. See, he puts it down a little bit. That's very good.
Okay.
Oh, is he here? Oh, stand up.
Coach. Yeah.
Wow. They really
Coach
went after
Kennedy.
you for saying a prayer before the... That is just... I didn't know you'd be here. Wow. The world is changing, isn't it? So you're not allowed to pray before a football game. I thought it was horrible. I thought it was horrible. So what did they do to you? What happened? Sorry to take away from your question, but it's sort of an extension of your question. What did they do?
That was Donald Trump's sort of mellow yellow version this morning at a forum in Virginia, where he seemed to be practicing some new, more personal town hall moves ahead of the next presidential debate. We are back with 3 reporters on the Trump beat. We have the Washington Post's Jenna Johnson, NBC News correspondent Katie Tur, and Bloomberg's own Kevin Cirilli. Jenna, I'm going to start with you. At this moment, at this hour, what do you know about the ways in which that speech relates to how Mr. Trump is trying to right his ship as he heads into the second debate this weekend in St. Louis?
Well, the campaign is trying to get him to practice more and just to be better prepared at the debate. But it's up to him if he wants to listen to the advice that they've been giving him for quite a while now and, you know, really study and really get ready. We saw last week, I was out on the trail with him the whole week, and in each of his speeches, he tackled one of the questions that came up at the first debate, and he kind of fumbled. And so we saw him give a very direct response to a comment that Hillary Clinton had made about implicit bias in police officers and how that's actually a problem for everyone. And he gave a response at a debate or at the rally that he could have given at the debate. This morning in Virginia at that town hall, he talked about cybersecurity, a question that he seemed to kind of fumble with at the debate. So you can kind of see how they're trying to get him prepared while he's already out in public, get him used to talking about these things. And also the town hall format, I hadn't seen him take questions from an audience like that on his own terms in quite a while.
It's been a while. Listen, it's Kevin, right, and Katie. Thank you both for coming. Donald Trump today talked to the people there like he was practicing for a town hall to feel the pain of the voters. I'm wondering, well, Katie, and Kevin first, then Katie, do you think Trump will excel at walking over to them and at repeating their names back and all that stuff? Like this, like I'm doing now?
I think the only time we've seen Donald Trump really in this type of format is on The Apprentice, and he was in the situation then of having to fire people. But this is going to be a dynamic, Mark, where he's going to be talking to people who are going to either hire or fire him. Yeah. And so the times that I've seen him interact with people over the course of the past year, I have to be honest here, I think
Kevin, thank you so much for your answer and your service to America. Katie, it's Katie, right? You're a hard-working young lady. I know in this economy that's difficult. Tell us your thoughts.
Yeah, I gotta agree with Kevin. The times we've seen him interact one-on-one with voters have not been inspiring, to put it to say the least. He's often very superficial with them. He'll walk up, he'll say hello, he'll have very small chit chat, and then he'll walk away. I haven't seen a conversation last for more than a few minutes. Usually he just walks in and says, "Oh, this is wonderful. Is this great? Isn't this great?" And then he moves on.
All right, I'm staying in my seat. KT, KC, JJ, you great. Thank you all. We'll be right back with you.
Watch our coverage of the VP debate on Bloomberg TV and on Twitter tomorrow. We'll be in Virginia. See you then. Thanks for watching. Sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. Let's begin with a check of your first word news. For the first time since copies of Donald Trump's 1995 tax report were leaked by the New York Times, he's publicly addressing the issue.
Fixing our broken tax code is one of the main reasons I'm running for president. I've been saying from the beginning of this campaign how ridiculous, complex, and yes, unfair the tax system is. It is an unfair system and so complex that very few people understand it.